All right, welcome back to the deep dive. You know, for this one, you've sent us into some pretty, let's just say, intense political territory.
Yeah.
We're going deep into the ideas of Niccolò Machiavelli,
Okay.
specifically the Prince,
Mm-hmm.
but we'll also be drawing from his life and other writings like the Discourses.
Right. Yeah.
So think of this as like really extracting the core, still debated wisdom from this. Well, he was a master of strategy, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
All tailored for you
Yeah.
from the sources that you sent us.
Rightly. And, you provided a really rich set of materials here that really explore just how complex Machiavelli is. I mean, the historical context, the philosophy, I mean, it continues to provoke, right?
Oh, yeah.
So our goal is to go way beyond that sort of one-dimensional, caricature that we often see
Right.
and really get to the heart of his thinking. Why does it still resonate? Or maybe, why does it still kind of disturb us today?
Yeah, it's a little unnerving, honestly. And he was quite a figure. I mean, born in Florence, 1469, diplomat, political theorist, and writer. His name alone,
Mm-hmm.
it kind of conjures up those images of real shrewdness and, I don't know, a very practical, maybe even ruthless approach to power, right?
Precisely. I mean, that's the image that he's come to represent, right? And as we dig into this, we've got to keep in mind this central idea, this thread that runs through it all, that we're looking at some pretty unsettling ideas. I mean, his ideas about how how they should govern effectively.
Mm-hmm.
We need to get a grasp of the Florence that he lived in, his own personal journey, and how those shaped his political philosophy. And it was a philosophy that really, it aimed at a kind of scientific understanding of power. He was deliberate in setting aside those, sort of fluffy ideal notions and even traditional ideas about morality.
Yeah. So let's set the stage. What was the world that forged Machiavelli? Let's talk family background.
Okay.
Old Tuscan roots, but not exactly, living the high life.
Yeah. No, not at all. That's such a crucial starting point. While the Machiavelli family did have deep ties to Florence going way back, by Niccolò's time, they were facing some really significant financial difficulties. I mean, his father, Bernardo, he was a lawyer,
Okay.
but he had severe money problems, even to the point of being declared insolvent.
Oh, wow.
So imagine that this early exposure to financial hardship, the need for resourcefulness,
Yeah.
it undoubtedly influenced Niccolò's perspective. It's a good reminder that even these great thinkers, they're shaped by their own very personal realities.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And his education, too. This wasn't the typical, elite schooling of the time.
Right.
It sounds like he was largely self-taught, right?
Indeed. I mean, formal schooling was limited due to the family's financial troubles.
Right.
However, his father, he did own books.
Yeah.
And Niccolò, he just became this voracious reader. And he was particularly drawn to, I would say, classical history and the history of Rome, the way it rose to power, the way it governed. Right.
That became a powerful model in his mind. I mean, it's something you see him refer back to again and again throughout his work.
Right. I mean, and Florence itself, during the Renaissance, I mean, this wasn't just any city. It was like the heart of everything, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Florence was the epicenter of the Renaissance, the financial and intellectual engine of the time.
Right.
Driven by, of course, those powerful banking families like the Medici.
Right.
It was a hub, just this explosion of innovation in art, science, in thought.
Yeah.
And you had this strong current of humanism, rediscovering and celebrating all that classical knowledge. It really shifted the focus towards human achievement, towards earth affairs. There was just this incredible energy, this sense of pushing boundaries, looking back to those models of antiquity. Of course, there were the underlying tensions and rivalries between all these powerful families, but you can just imagine the young Machiavelli soaking all of this up, the high-minded ideals, alongside the sometimes very, very brutal realities of these power struggles. Yeah, so picture this. You've got this young, sharp mind in this super dynamic but also super volatile environment. How did his personal experiences start to mold his, I don't know, I'd say pretty unflinching worldview?
I think that's where the story really takes this sharp turn. Machiavelli wasn't just, an observer standing on the sidelines. He was a player in Florentine politics.
Okay.
He served the Republic, a variety of roles, important roles. He was secretary of the Second Chancery. He was undertaking diplomatic missions. I mean, imagine him being right there in the room where decisions were made, where the fate of, the city-state was being negotiated.
All right.
But then when the Medici returned, he experienced this dramatic and pretty brutal fall from grace.
Right.
I mean, we're talking imprisonment, torture, exile. And it was a sudden shift, going from insider to outcast,
Right.
from having a voice to being completely powerless. It profoundly affected his thinking about power itself and how it's held onto. He saw, up close and personal, just how fragile political standing could be.
Yeah.
And the often ruthless actions that were needed just to hold on to control.
Right, because it wasn't just ancient history he was reading about. I mean, he was living history, often pretty violently. Like you mentioned the Pazzi conspiracy. I mean, that sounds like something straight out of, like, a modern-day political thriller.
It really was. The Pazzi conspiracy in 1478, this audacious attempt to assassinate Lorenzo and Giuliano de' Medici, right there during High Mass, during Easter, no less.
Wow.
Machiavelli, although young, he would have witnessed the chaos, the brutal reprisals that followed. Then you have the French invasion under Charles VIII in 1494. It really showed just how vulnerable Florence was. I mean, and that led to the rise and fall of Savonarola, which was it was this intensely religious and political upheaval. And we can't forget his dealings with Caesar Borgia, whose ruthlessness and ambition, I mean, they clearly left a mark on Machiavelli. These weren't just, stories in a book.
Yeah.
These were real life examples right in front of him, showing how effective and, also the consequences of swift, decisive action and sometimes really brutal action. He saw how quickly power could change hands and really the heavy cost of weakness.
Right. So, I mean, all this intense firsthand experience, this immersion in this world of political scheming and violence, it leads him to write The Prince. I mean, and he wrote this during his exile.
Yeah.
So it's a period of forced reflection. But it also seems like a very strategic move on his part to maybe try and get back in the game, right?
Exactly. I mean, he was stripped of his position, desperate to find a way back into those Florentine circles of power. And so he writes The Prince. You can almost think of it as his application.
Yeah.
His demonstration of just how well he understood how power worked. He intended it to be a very practical guide, for rulers on how to acquire and, crucially, how to hold on to their authority. And, at first he dedicated to Giuliano de' Medici, and then later, after Giuliano's death, to Lorenzo de' Medici.
Yeah.
So clearly hoping to prove his worth, maybe get brought back into the fold.
And right from the start, he kind of throws out the old playbook, doesn't he?
He does.
He's not interested in these, fluffy ideal states or how things should be. He's like, look, let's talk about the reality, the hard reality of how things are.
Precisely. I mean, Machiavelli, he made this really clean break from the utopian political philosophies that had come before. He wasn't interested in blueprints for perfect societies. He was focused, laser focused on those practical mechanics of power, how you get it, how you use it, how you keep it.
Right.
In a world that he saw as, at its core, very unstable and driven by self-interest. And so his primary objective for any ruler, as he famously said, is mantenere lo Stato, to maintain the state, to ensure its survival, its stability above all else.
And, I mean, he really analyzes different kinds of states, right?
Yeah.
Hereditary, new, those that are used to being ruled, those that are used to being free. It's almost like he's like a surgeon, just dissecting the political landscape with incredible precision.
Yeah, it's a very systematic and pragmatic analysis. And for each type of state, for each principality, he outlines the specific challenges and the most effective strategies. Like when he's talking about newly acquired territories, he advises the ruler to either, go live there personally, which is what the Ottoman Turks did in Greece. It allows for, quick responses to problems, or to establish colonies. And he actually draws parallels to Roman methods of control. So these weren't just abstract theories.
Right.
These were very concrete recommendations based on, his study of history and, of course, his own experience.
And he even compares different governing styles. He talks about the centralized rule in Turkey versus that more decentralized system in France with its powerful nobles. What was he getting at with those comparisons?
What I find really insightful there is how well he understood how different structures of power, how they affected both how easy it was to conquer a place,
right,
but also the long-term stability of rule. So he argues that, a really centralized state like Turkey, where everyone's essentially a servant to the ruler, it might be tougher to conquer initially because there aren't a lot of internal factions to exploit.
Okay.
But then once it's conquered, it's easier to maintain control because you don't have these independent nobles who can challenge you.
Yeah.
France, on the other hand, with its established nobility, its hierarchy.
Right.
It might be easier to invade at first because of all the potential for dissent and the ambitions of all these powerful lords, but it's way harder to truly control in the long run because they have their own legitimacy, they have their own resources.
Right. Okay, so now we're getting to the stuff that has made him, infamous.
Yeah.
The controversial advice. Let's talk about cruelty. He says, cruelties inflicted immediately. I mean, that just sounds so harsh.
It does, doesn't it? I mean, to our modern ears, it sounds brutal.
Yeah.
But Machiavelli's logic was that if a ruler, if they need to use harsh measures to secure their power, it's much better to do it quickly, decisively, all at once.
Okay.
His thinking was that these cruelties inflicted immediately, if they're followed by a period of stability, maybe even some benefits for the people,
Right.
they're less likely to cause that long-term resentment than, a bunch of smaller punishments over time,
Right.
which can just feel like this constant, oppression. And he even says, it's a chilling caveat. He says, if one can speak well of evil. So clearly, I mean, he wasn't unaware of the moral implications,
Right.
but he's prioritizing the practical outcome. What's going to create stability for the state.
So it's like that kind of triage approach. You've got to do this hard thing quickly, like maybe think of it in a modern context, although it's a little uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Like a company that has to do a really painful restructuring to survive.
Right. I mean, short-term pain for hopefully long-term gain.
Exactly. And then there's that, that very famous dilemma.
Yeah.
Is it better to be loved or feared?
Right.
I mean, ideally you want both.
Of course. Yeah.
But if you had to pick.
Yeah, if you're forced to choose. And his conclusion, I mean, it's stark, and it's one of those quotes that everybody knows.
Mm.
It's safer to be feared than loved.
Mm.
And his reasoning is, well, it's based on his rather pessimistic view of human nature, I'd say.
Correct.
He believed that love, it's fickle, right? It's based on a sense of obligation, and people will break that obligation when it's convenient for them.
Right.
Fear, though, fear is based on that anticipation of punishment, which is just a much more constant and reliable way to make sure people obey.
Right.
But he does caution against becoming hated. He makes it clear that a ruler can be feared without being hated by consistently respecting the people's property and their women.
Okay. Interesting. It really comes down to managing your image too, doesn't it?
It does.
Like appearing virtuous, even if what you're doing behind the scenes is not exactly saintly.
Absolutely. Machiavelli, he emphasized just how crucial it was for a prince to seem to have all these virtuous qualities: mercy, faith, humanity, integrity, piety.
Yeah, all the good stuff.
All the good stuff, right.
Right.
But then he argues that, actually being bound by those virtues all the time could actually be really bad if you want to stay in power. It's that famous line, everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are.
Right.
So the key is to cultivate that public image, that persona of virtue, because that's what people judge by, even if, in private, sometimes you have to do things that aren't, perfectly aligned with those ideals.
Interesting. So it's almost like the perception of virtue being more potent politically than actually practicing it all the time.
Exactly.
Now, let's talk about virtue, because it's a word that often gets, I think, misinterpreted. It's not exactly how we understand virtue in our everyday sense, is it?
No, not quite. Machiavelli's virtue, it's much more nuanced. It's really about skill, strength, the ability to act decisively, do what needs to be done in any situation. And think about that root of the word ver, man. Right?
Okay.
It suggests this kind of, masculine vigor and strength.
Yeah.
It's the ability to seize opportunities, what he called occasion.
Okay.
And to do whatever it takes, whatever is necessary to preserve the state, even if it goes against, those traditional moral ideas. So it's less about being inherently, good in that moral sense,
right,
and more about being effective, being adaptable, even cunning to achieve your political goals. It's about having that resilience, the strategic, mindset to navigate all the unpredictable currents of, fate or fortune.
Right. And speaking of fortuna,
yes,
that's the element of chance, the unpredictable.
Yeah.
How does that fit into his thinking?
Well, Machiavelli believed that human affairs, they're influenced by both our actions, the choices we make, but also by fortuna, by chance, by fate, by luck, however you want to put it.
Right.
And he famously said that fortuna controls about half of our lives, while the other half is governed by our own choices, our free will, and, our virtue. So the wise prince, they've got to be able to recognize, to seize those opportunities that fortune presents when they come up, but also be ready to adapt, to change course when fortune turns against them. It's this constant dance between skillful action and, the unpredictable nature of events. He uses that powerful image of a raging river. We can't stop the river, but we can build dams. We can build channels to try to mitigate its destructive force.
Right. And I love how he uses those animal metaphors too. The fox and the lion.
Yeah.
That a prince needs to be both.
Yeah.
It's such a great image.
It really sticks with you. It's a very memorable and effective analogy. So he argued, right, that a prince needs the cunning of the fox to see those traps, to avoid them.
Right.
But also the strength, the ferocity of a lion to ward off wolves. And relying just on one or the other, it just won't cut it. I mean, strength without cunning, you're vulnerable to deception. Cunning without strength,
right.
Well, you're just defenseless. So a successful ruler needs to be adaptable, knowing when to be shrewd, when to be forceful.
Okay, so bringing it all together, what are the key takeaways here? The separation of politics from morality seems like a really central and still debated point.
It is. I mean, arguably, it's the most significant and probably the most controversial element of his whole philosophy. Machiavelli basically argued that the rules of the game for a ruler whose main responsibility is the preservation, the stability of the state, those rules might be different from the rules that govern individual morality. And that's really the essence of realpolitik, right? The idea that political actions, they should be guided by those practical considerations of power and national interests rather than by just ethics or ideology.
Right.
And that whole notion of the ends justify the means, though he never explicitly said it that way, it definitely comes from this core idea.
So it's interesting because Machiavelli also seems to have had this real sense of patriotism.
Yes, he did.
I mean, especially that last chapter of The Prince. It's almost like a call to arms for Italy.
It is. And that's a crucial and sometimes overlooked part of his work.
Yeah.
Because despite his, often cynical take on human nature and how ruthlessly power plays out, Machiavelli was a passionate Florentine and a passionate Italian patriot.
Okay.
That final chapter of The Prince, it's this fervent plea for a strong leader, someone who can unite that fractured Italian peninsula and get rid of all the foreign powers that were running the show.
Yeah.
And it is a bit of a contrast to some of his, more detached observations earlier in the book, maybe hinting at, a hope that a prince with enough virtue, with enough skill and cunning could actually inspire that national unity and overcome what he saw as the weaknesses of the Italian states.
Okay. So we got to remember, the prince itself was dedicated to the Medici family.
Yes.
The very people who were responsible for his downfall and exile.
Right.
So, I mean, was that just a purely strategic move on his part?
I mean, there's no doubt that the dedication was a calculated move. He was trying to get back in good with the Medici rulers, maybe get a position back in Florentine politics. But even if, self-interest was a big driver, the book itself, I mean, it offers this really systematic and insightful look at power.
Right.
It's not just empty flattery. It's almost like he's saying, here's how I understand ruling effectively, and maybe it'll be useful to you, and maybe, just maybe, you'll find me useful too.
Right. It's very Machiavellian, really.
It is, yeah.
Now, he also wrote other things, not just The Prince. I mean, most notably the Discourses on Livy.
Right.
How do those writings compare to The Prince? Because The Prince seems so focused on that single ruler.
Right. Well, the Discourses, they're really interesting. They offer this kind of contrasting perspective.
Okay.
While The Prince is all about how a single ruler gains and keeps power, the Discourses are more about the history of the Roman Republic.
Okay.
And generally, Machiavelli seems to lean towards republics, forms of government where citizens have more of a say. So a lot of scholars think that the Discourses actually give us a more complete and maybe even a more accurate view of Machiavelli's real political beliefs.
Okay.
You've also got his play, The Mandrake. It's a satire,
right?
But it still shows off his really sharp wit and his insightful observations about how people behave, how societies function. But the common thread throughout all these different types of writing, it's this unflinching examination of power, the role of fortune, and how complex human nature is in the political realm.
So, looking back, the term Machiavellianism,
Right.
it has this really negative meaning. How did his name become so associated with, almost evil and cunning in politics?
Yeah, that negative perception that Machiavellianism means being deceitful, ruthless, that really developed after his death.
Okay.
And the Reformation, it had a big role in that. His writings started being interpreted as, promoting tyranny, and they got linked to what some people saw as the immorality of the Italian Renaissance and the Catholic Church. So Protestant writers used his ideas to criticize their opponents. And then, popular culture, especially in literature, in plays. I mean, think of all those Shakespearean villains. They really solidified that image of Machiavelli as this, cynical, amoral figure.
Right. But wasn't he at his core really just challenging some very deep-seated beliefs about human nature?
I think so.
And about the ideal way to govern? I mean, his views were pretty radical for his time.
They were. His view of human nature, which was that they're mostly self-interested, they're fickle, they're driven by ambition.
Right.
It challenged all those more optimistic, idealistic political theories that were around at the time. He questioned the whole idea that there were these universal moral principles that could just neatly apply to politics.
Okay.
He was much more focused on what he saw as those really practical realities of keeping order, maintaining security in what he saw as a very imperfect world. Yeah. And, he forced people to confront this possibility, this uncomfortable possibility that maybe effective governing, sometimes it requires actions that in your private life you would see as morally wrong.
Right. And that really reminds me of this idea of ethical pluralism. It's something that thinkers like Isaiah Berlin have written about.
Right.
So how do you see Machiavelli fitting into that?
Well, I think what's really relevant here is that, Machiavelli's work, it can be seen as an early example of, how complicated ethical choices can be, especially in politics.
Yeah.
He seemed to get that there isn't always one right answer or a single set of moral principles that can just, perfectly guide political decisions. The things that you need for a political community to survive and flourish, things like security, order, stability, they can clash with traditional moral values that we hold as individuals: honesty, compassion, loyalty.
Right.
So it raises this really challenging idea that maybe different parts of our lives, like our personal life versus our political life, maybe they have different ethical frameworks.
Right.
And maybe those frameworks are, sometimes impossible to reconcile. Like a leader, they might feel they have to break a promise, which is usually seen as a bad thing.
Right.
But they might have to do it if keeping that promise would destroy the state, lead to widespread suffering. Now, Machiavelli doesn't necessarily say that's the right thing to do, but he makes us think about that conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. So ultimately, what's the lasting impact of his ideas? Is The Prince just, a dusty old book? Or does it still have something to say to us about, how power works in today's world?
I mean, that's the million-dollar question. And it's what keeps Machiavelli so relevant even centuries later. Is The Prince a how-to guide for dictators, for ruthless people who just want power? Or is it a realistic look at what happens in extreme political situations?
Right.
Or does it reveal something even deeper, something maybe a little uncomfortable, like a political subconscious that's actually there in every kind of government, even in democracies?
Right.
I mean, it's up for debate.
Yeah.
But regardless of how you interpret it,
Yeah.
his work makes us think about these fundamental things. What is power? What motivates leaders?
Mm-hmm.
What's the relationship between ethics and politics? You know, it definitely pushes us to look past all the fancy political talk and really see those underlying strategies, those calculations.
So to sum it up, this deep dive into Machiavelli shows us this complex figure whose life and writings, and especially The Prince, they give us this very stark and often really unsettling view of power, how to get it and how to keep it.
Absolutely. I mean, his focus on pragmatism, his willingness to separate, you know, what's politically necessary from traditional morality, and his deep understanding of how skill, virtue, and chance fortuna, how they constantly interact. I mean, it sparks debate even today, and it offers valuable, even if sometimes a bit uncomfortable, insights into how power really works in human affairs, which hasn't really changed all that much.
So now that we've gone on this journey with Machiavelli, you know, going beyond those simple labels to try to understand the man, his world, his core arguments, here's a final thought for you all out there listening. thinking about that idea that Machiavelli separated politics and morality.
Right.
Can you see these principles at play today
Yeah.
in our leaders?
Yeah.
Whether it's politics or business or any other area where people have influence.
Mm-hmm.
And if so, what does it mean if we look at power through this kind of unvarnished lens?
I mean, that's the thing about these deep dives. They're really just the beginning of this much bigger conversation. So we encourage you, go back to Machiavelli's own writing, explore the huge range of interpretations and criticisms that are out there. What parts of his thinking speak to you?
Right.
What do you find the most challenging or the most insightful given the world that we live in?
Yeah.
These are questions that have kept people thinking for centuries.
Yeah.
And your own perspective is a really important part of that ongoing conversation. So thanks for joining us as we, dive deep.
Dive deep.
All right, we'll see you next time.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.